Hello, I'm Anne McLean for Concerts from the Library of Congress. This week, we're presenting a special concert from the Colburn School's Ziering-Conlon Initiative for Recovered Voices. Established by the conductor James Conlon and the philanthropist Marilyn Ziering, the initiative encourages awareness of composers whose lives and careers were suppressed or destroyed by the Nazi regime in Europe. Talking with Maestro Conlon and with Adam Milstein, Colburn School violinist who performed in the concert you'll see and produced the video that we'll be sharing. Thank you so much for being here.
Our pleasure.
Our
I can
pleasure.
speak for both of us.
Yeah, exactly.
You've chosen a beautiful and noteworthy program, Franz Schreker's 1916 Kammer Symphony and Mieczysław Weinberg's String Trio, Opus 48. And you also introduced two works connected to the Colburn School's history by composers who escaped persecution in Europe and later came to California, Herbert Zipper and Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco. Maestro Conlon, you've been a passionate advocate for this generation of composers, reclaiming their music for over 25 years. I know this grew out of your pioneering work at the LA Opera, bringing to life operas by major figures like Victor Ullmann and Schreker's Der Ferne Klang. And I believe in 2010, you mounted the first staging of Franz Schreker's The Stigmatized. When did you begin to think about continuing your work and establishing a new initiative at the Colburn School?
Well, my first contact and my first awakening, as it was, and my first activities were all in Germany, in Cologne, and it started at the beginning of the 90s. At first discovering Alexander Zemlinsky's music, then moving on to Franz Schreker, then moving on to Victor Ullmann, and having an epiphany at a certain moment that made me realize that the only reason that I, who I'm a practicing musician all my life, had never heard most of this music, it's not the fault of the music, it's the fault of the Nazi regime. And that somebody somehow had to address that and start doing something to awaken as much consciousness about the existence of music, getting people to play the music. There's not so much a problem of finding the music, it's a problem to get people to actually play it and listen to it. And so it's almost 30 years old. Now, when I came to Los Angeles Opera, which was, I started in 2006, I initiated at least I shared the idea that I thought we should do as many operas as we could. And then we started in 2006. And you are right that the very first opera by Franz Schreker to be produced on stage in America was an LA Opera production, I think 2011. The title is Die Gezeichneten. It's a very hard word to translate. We chose The Stigmatized, but you might choose some other way to translate that word. But it's a massive opera. Shortly thereafter, I began collaborating with the Colburn School, and thanks to the generosity of Marilyn Ziering, we were able to establish the Ziering-Conlon Initiative for Recovered Voices. Recovered Voices is a coined term that was coined at Los Angeles Opera, and we thank them for that. And the subject is very broad. It's not limited to opera, it's not limited to anything except for all of the music that you and I should know, or should have known, could have known, if it hadn't been for the Nazi suppression. And so in the most recent years, I am very happy that the Colburn School is fostering, and thanks to people, Adam Milstein above all, but thanks to that the students are now involving themselves. And this, of course, is what I want, because as a person, as they like to say in France, of a certain age, I want to assure that this goes on after my time, because this will not be accomplished in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. This will take a generation, maybe more, for it to sink in. And so I have worked as much around the country as I can with young musicians to whet their appetites. And I have found that to be very satisfying, but I found it particularly satisfying here at the Colburn School.
You've created a really impressive framework there, taking in not only performances, but educational projects like the new, very handsome video miniseries on Erwin Schulhoff, which can be seen on your website, and also recordings, symposia, and so on. It's impressive how this has grown, and I wanted to talk to you, Adam, about your role in this. What has been your experience and involvement? I know you're a performer, but also you've taken on a new role, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are about it.
Definitely. So my real turning point with all of this is I was asked to perform music by Ernst Toch, who is a recovered voices composer, Austrian, who was exiled to Los Angeles at the Thomas Mann House, which is here in the Pacific Palisades. And this was a really life-changing thing for me because it was here that I was really first fully exposed to the Recovered Voices Initiative and its mission. I heard Maestro Conlon speak there, which was sincerely just a life-changing experience to learn about this and to play the music of these exiled composers in a place like the Thomas Mann House, who himself was exiled. It was a very profound experience for me. And as a result, actually, when COVID happened and the world shut down, I found myself able to actually delve deeper into this music and the mission. And I visited the Aurel Foundation website, which is this wonderful resource of not fully comprehensive, but many of these composers are listed, their biographies, their works. And I dug deep into the website and I became infatuated with Erwin Schulhoff in particular. And the first piece that really caught my attention was his second piano concerto. So the first thing I did was I sent it to one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dominic Cayley, who is an alumnus of the Colburn School and a wonderful pianist. I sent him the music. I said, you have to listen to this ASAP. And he fell in love with Schulhoff as well. And as a result, we began collaborating as musicians on the music of Schulhoff. And I was introduced to Robert Elias, who's a wonderful mentor and has been deeply involved with the Recovered Voices Initiative for many years, who then introduced me to Maestro Conlon, and both of them have become tremendous mentors for me in this field, and I brought along a lot of my colleagues here at the Colburn School. So during COVID, we were actually able to record, I believe, 8 or 9 pieces by Erwin Schulhoff that I curated and sort of produced these video recordings, and Maestro Conlon agreed to conduct the Schulhoff second piano concerto, and that was, again, I keep using the word life-changing, but it really was a life-changing experience to be able to collaborate with Maestro Conlon in that regard on a musical level, and then also being so inspired on an intellectual level by all the work that Maestro has done. And sort of, it's been a completely, my career now, I feel like I want to focus fully on these composers and on the mission of bringing them to light. And it's been wonderful that Colburn has been so supportive of this and of these endeavors, and that so many of my colleagues are now performing the music of Schulhoff, of Weinberg, of Schraker, all the time now at the Colburn School. And it's just been a wonderful experience.
I'd love to talk in depth and with David as well about the Schraker in particular, such an influential work and a major work, and also the Weinberg. But I wanted to touch on the 2 pieces that are very much connected with your history there at the Colburn School. You really drew these from the archives. Robert Elias, whom I must thank very warmly for his work in making this video possible. We've talked about this for a couple of years now, and during the pandemic, we weren't sure, of course, what was going to happen, but we're thrilled that you were able to collaborate by sending it to us. But I wanted to ask you about the Herbert Zipper piece, The 2 Dances for Trudel. He was a director of the Colburn School, is that correct?
That's right. So he was a dear friend and advisor to the founder of the Colburn School, Richard Colburn. And Herbert Zipper himself was actually considered one of the founders of the community arts movement in the United States. He has a very fascinating history. He was born in Vienna. He was a composer and a conductor, and he was actually in both Dachau and Buchenwald. Eventually, he was released in the late 30s. He ended up in Manila, invited there to run the symphony, and then while he was in Manila there with his wife, the Japanese invaded Manila, and he was imprisoned also by the Japanese. Eventually, he survived that and ended up in the United States, first in Chicago and then eventually in Los Angeles. And it was here in the US that he really sort of fostered this mission of arts education for all. He was an early champion of this and sort of a total optimist going forward, even given his the atrocities that he experienced and that he survived. He persevered. He always emphasized the importance of arts and education in the United States. And that's when he began to collaborate with Richard Colburn. And they helped to sort of found the Community School of Performing Arts, which then turned into the Colburn School that we know and love today, and that I am now a student at. When I was growing up, I was also in the Community School, which is the high school, one of the high school divisions here at Colburn. And the big mission for them was to allow arts access for anyone that wanted it with no barrier for entry and from the earliest ages possible. So Herbert Zipper was, integral in sort of continuing and starting that mission here at Colburn. And all the recordings that you will see in this video take place in the Herbert Zipper Concert Hall. And also his wife, Trudel Dubsky Zipper, the Colburn Dance Institute is actually named after her. And that began in 2008 when money was donated to create the Trudel Zipper Dance Institute here. And she was a wonderful dancer as well. And she was a part of the Austrian free dance movement and has a very interesting history. So Colburn houses the Herbert Zipper and Trudel Zipper archives here at the school. So I was actually very interested in sort of the interplay between dance and music in interwar Vienna. And I was like, well, what a better place to look than here at Colburn at these archives. And I literally was just digging through and finding all this fascinating information about how dance and music were programmed in Vienna. And there was all these like literal performance programs of Trudel's and also of Herbert that were fascinating to look at, these old photographs, and also all of these manuscripts there. And I was kind of looking through some of Zipper's manuscripts, and I found this work there, this unpublished 2 dances for Trudel that he wrote either in 1929 or 1936. So I took photographs of it, I scanned it, I had one of my composer friends engrave it so it could actually be legible, and then I presented it to a wonderful pianist here named Sam Glicklich, and I was like, Sam, would you mind playing this piece? And he was like, of course. And he did a beautiful job. So we're going to have a world premiere recording of these 2 dancers that were written by Herbert for his wife, Trudel. And there's wonderful choreography done by Alexa Dollar and Andrew Leibold, who are 2 wonderful Trudel Zipper Dance Institute students here at the Colburn School that was oversaw by our new dean, Silas Farley. But they choreographed the dances themselves. So we have not only a world premiere instrumental recording, but also a world premiere choreography done inspired by Herbert and Trudel and their legacy.
Wonderful. We had no idea that it would be a world premiere when we first began talking with Bob. So these archival connections are fascinating. And of course, at the library, that's our work, that's our business. And David is interested in following up about the Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco piece because we hold that collection. And this piece is kind of an interesting gesture in so many ways. David, do you want to talk about this?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you both for being here and speaking about this wonderful program. And I'm excited to hear it. And I actually want to learn a little bit more about how you came to hold this piece that's in its relationship to Piatigorsky. And I'd love to hear that. And then I could say a couple words about the library's connection to Castelnuovo.
Definitely. So the piece in and of itself is, admittedly, it's not housed at the Colburn archive. The manuscript. We had it's out of print and we found it in another library, fortunately. But what we do have at Colburn is the Piatigorsky archives, which were gifted to Colburn by the Piatigorsky Foundation. And it's thousands of manuscripts and correspondences and photographic material that musicologists and different people got together here at Colburn, and they helped to digitize it and made it accessible to everyone here at the school and to the world at large. So we actually house a very fascinating letter from Castelnuovo Tedesco to Piatigorsky. That's in our actual archive. And this piece, as I was digging through the works of Castelnuovo Tedesco, came up, and I was like, this looks fascinating. It's a really charming work. It's part of his greeting card series, it's called. So he wrote about 52 pieces for different friends of his, and this one is based on the name Gregor Piatigorsky. So each letter is denoted a different sort of note value, and the melody of the piece and what it's based off of is Gregor Piatigorsky's name. And it's a really charming work. There's references even to Tchaikovsky in it, like deliberate references in the score. Castelnuovo Tedesco writes, Gregor meet Tchaikovsky, Tchaikovsky meet Gregor. It's very fun. It's a charming, elegant piece. And it's just cool to see their sort of friendship in a musical form take part in its connection to the Recovered Voices Initiative as well.
If I can just add to this,
Please.
just add to this, that we feel particularly privileged here in Los Angeles and in Southern California because one of the greatest communities of artists, writers, musicians, composers was founded here as a result of the forced emigration of so many of these exceptional artists forced by the Nazi regime and the Nazi suppression. We're very lucky here in Los Angeles because there are so many roots and so many connections to all of this. And I'm, of course, very happy that we are able to present this. It almost feels like a direct line. And Anne, I'm very glad that you mentioned the Aurel Foundation website because Bob Elias and I, made that some 15 years ago specifically as a response to my experience coming back to America after living in Europe for many years, starting to perform with American orchestras, starting to give works in this area, say, well, where do I find out more about this? And there was no place to send them. There were no books. There were very few books. The books are mostly in German. To this day, that still is largely the case. But of course, the internet has grown to such a degree that our website is one of the most visited in the world now for this subject. And it goes hand in hand with all of the other Recovered Voices activities, wherever they might be. And I would love to invite everybody to visit Aurel, that's O-R-E-L Foundation. We're not a foundation, we don't have any money, so please don't ask us for any. We're a foundation that needs money. We actually don't. We're just there as a source of information and a resource. And I'm happy. In the wake of COVID, we have also learned a great, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
We have also learned a great deal of how to communicate with the world through streaming in a way that was around a few years ago, but wasn't as popular. And so Adam and I, Colburn and all, we're working toward using the most recent technology in order to get our message out.
That's wonderful. I just want to say that we are very much in line with your desire to spread the music and the way to access them. And as a library, that's one of our goals too. But it's not as we aren't able to do it as often in performance as we would like to make it come alive like you were able to. So we're definitely appreciative of that. We share that value and that goal for sure. I just wanted to mention, just speaking of our archives overlapping a bit, there are a couple of things that just came up as you were speaking, Adam, about this, in that in our Jascha Heifetz collection, we have his collection of materials and manuscripts. I believe it might be a facsimile, but we have a Piatigorsky transcription of Suite Italienne for violin and cello, and I don't know if you hold that.
We do. We have that here. We have the literal. I've looked at it. It's amazing. They did together I think they were on a ship together or something like that.
It's
fantastic.
Well, that's wonderful. I just that came to mind when you were saying that. But the other thing about this is that with the library's perspective, we have a lot of this huge amount of music. There's somewhere around 26 million items that you can look at, and we want people to come and look at them. But of course, with COVID, we had to pull back from that as a goal. But now that things are easing up a little bit, we do encourage people to explore, especially in our Castelnuovo Tedesco collection. We have almost 8,000 items in that collection. And I looked at just like cello and piano alone. There's some of them are like versions of the cello concerto for cello and piano. We have about 9 or 10 different manuscripts or annotated early editions in his hands. So it's definitely a resource that we'd love to be able to connect with other libraries or foundations that are doing this kind of work to make people aware of these things.
Fantastic.
And if I can give a plug right back to you to the Library of Congress collection, the first composer that set me on this path was Alexander Zemlinsky. And I have been to the Library of Congress several times and have spent hours going through the original scores of Zemlinsky. You have the most important and the most significant collection of the works of Alexander Zemlinsky, and I've held them in my own hands, and I can tell you that that is a great, great emotion. And so thank you to the Library of Congress and to what you have there in so many, many different areas, including recovered voices.
Absolutely, and we have about 350 items in that collection, and then there's so much of interdependence between what we have with Arnold Schoenberg and other there's correspondence between all of these amazing people. Korngold, another one where we have about 9,000 items in that collection. There's these wonderful kind of interplays that you can find out between all of these composers. But in any case, let's get back to your program, because it's such a fascinating one. I'll turn it back over to Anne, but it's a wonderful beginning to the program and also then continuing on.
Well, speaking of Arnold Schoenberg, whose collection we also have, it's wonderful to hear the Colburn Orchestra, excellent orchestra, in this performance of the Schreker Kammersymphony, which I believe was influenced by the Schoenberg First Chamber Symphony. And Maestro Conlon, I know that you've talked about the composer's very rich harmonic language in this piece, and you also had a great quote about how, as in Wagner and Strauss, the orchestra is the protagonist, and yet it's written for 23 or 24 sort of almost solo players, right? I mean, their playing is virtuosic and individualistic.
Well, as you rightly point out, this was inspired by the Schoenberg First Chamber Symphony, and unabashedly so. I think to start with the idea of a smaller group, somewhat larger than Schoenberg, but not large enough to even consider it a chamber orchestra, is written in 4 movements, but 4 movements that are played without interruption. And of course, this comes directly from the Schoenberg model. And so that the material set out in the first, second, and third movements are recapitulated in the last movement, and so it makes a unity in a very similar fashion. It is, however, Schreker and not Schoenberg. It's a very different aesthetic, a very different feeling, and very coloristic. Not that Schoenberg isn't, he is, but Schreker's penchant for creating orchestral colors is one of his strongest suits, and one sees this in the dramatic works, in the operas. Now, he wrote very few works specifically for orchestra. Somehow or other, his heart was in the theater, and this was written and premiered during the First World War, the time of I would say, some of his greatest compositions, Der ferne Klang, the Gezeichneten. These are works that I think really encapsulate where you can locate him. And it's an interesting combination of influences. He is not purely Viennese in the sense that you can say, well, here's his lineage. They all had the same lineage, which was what? Wagner and Brahms. They're the next generation. And they were the generation that was trying to make a synthesis of the antagonism between the schools of Brahms and the school of Wagner. And they said, no, these are both great masters and these are both great schools, and let's find a way to bring it all together. Schreker has done that in the same manner as has Schoenberg, as has Berg, as did Zemlinsky. I think to situate Schreker, though, we have to take into consideration that he also was very influenced by Impressionism and what was coming out of France, and even Verismo opera that was coming out of Italy. And so he is, in a certain sense, a very European composer and stands very close to them. And I'm very grateful to so much of what I've learned about Schreker to Christopher Haley, who is probably the great scholar and writer on the subject of Schreker, who said, we talk about the second Viennese school, and we say Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. He said, but in a certain way, it would be more appropriate to talk about Schoenberg, Berg, and Schreker from the point of view of the expression, expressionistic, if you will. Webern is the outlier here, although, of course, strictly dodecaphonic and very controlled and very, as we know, concise. The spirit of Schraker, which is expansive and almost larger than life, corresponds much more with the early Schoenberg of Gurrelieder, the chamber symphony, that expansive, and of course Berg picked up that as well. These are the big emotions, and expressed in a very broad way. You get it in a wonderful, concise form in the chamber symphony, but one has to imagine big concept and expressionism and almost exaggeration of emotions. Very deeply emotional piece.
Thinking about the way you described some of the things I was wondering about earlier, Schreker's position in Austrian musical culture was among the most respected, and he was a teacher of major composers, as we know, like Ernst Krenek. He was an opera composer who was a peer of Strauss and others, and I believe he conducted the premiere of Schoenberg's Gurrelieder. So when you read about these things, you are astonished that such a person could have been so eradicated. His music, his legacy could have been so eradicated. How it happened so fast in the late 1920s. And this is it's beyond our comprehension, really. I'm sure we would not have known as much about his music today if it were not for you and the work that you've done about him. I didn't know his music, actually. But how did you first encounter it? I'm curious about that.
Well, first let me say that as we talk about cancel and cancel culture, what the Nazis did is a prime example of it done on a massive scale. And Schreker is probably the most outstanding example of a successful, outstandingly recognized composer who was reduced to nothing. Now, some of the composers that I defend, that Adam defends, were outsiders. I mean, Erwin Schulhoff was an outsider all his life. They were struggling artists, which of course in history is the rule rather than the exception. But Schreker was an exception. Schreker was feted everywhere, and his operas were produced everywhere, and he had a lifetime contract with Universal Editions, and all of that disappeared when the Nazis took power in Germany. And in fact, his wife, his widow, I should say, because by then he had died, returned to Germany. She reported that she went through all of the bookstores in Berlin and she could not find a single copy of anything that had been written by her late husband. My first acquaintance with Schreker came directly out of my interest in Zemlinsky, because of course they knew each other. They even had some projects in common with one another, and they are in a certain way coming out of the same aesthetic community. They each have their personality, but I became fascinated right away with Franz Schreker because I saw him as a sort of a cousin to the composer with whom I had just fallen in love, and that was Alexander Zemlinsky. So before branching out to a lot of other things, particularly the Terezin composers and Erwin Schulhoff, who are in many regards were less successful, Schreker was my next step in that progression.
It's wonderful to share this with our audiences. I don't think we've ever had a Schreker piece on our series. And the Weinberg, David has been looking into the string trio that I believe you're working on this, Adam, you're performing this, is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
This is an example of further 20th century repression by a horrific regime. But in terms of the music, it's so remarkably textured. Talk about both of you, David and you, Mr. Conlon. Talk a little bit about this. It's a beautiful piece that I think was only published in 2007.
That's right. Well, Mieczysław Weinberg for me has become. My entry point was Erwin Schulhoff, and then I've become absolutely obsessed with Weinberg, and I've now recorded his piano trio with Clive Greensmith and Dominic Cayley, which I think is sincerely a masterpiece of the 20th century. I've taken his Fifth Violin Sonata and his Moldavian Rhapsody on tour in a recital program that I've played all over the US now and continue to play And now his string trio, I've had the great fortune to record for this project and to also perform it. And we'll be performing it a lot over the summer as well. Weinberg is a really fascinating historical figure. He was, in a sense, sort of twice suppressed in many regards. He was born in Warsaw, in Poland. He fled the Nazis on foot. The rest of his family stayed behind. His sister almost made it to the border of Belarus with him, but unfortunately, she turned back, complaining that her feet hurt, and he never saw his family again, his parents and sister. He made it to Belarus, to Minsk, where he was studying composition. He was a wonderful pianist also. The Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and then Weinberg went further out, all the way to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where his manuscript or one of his symphonies was actually from there sent to Dmitri Shostakovich. So that initiated this long friendship and relationship between Shostakovich and Weinberg. Shostakovich actually had Weinberg come out to Moscow with his family, and they lived in the same apartment building together. They actually premiered a few of Shostakovich's symphonies together for piano four hands, which is a really fascinating tidbit. But they really treated each other like colleagues. Even though Weinberg, of course, is a great admirer of Shostakovich, it wasn't necessarily mentor and student. They really saw each other as equals, and Shostakovich was a big supporter and proponent of Weinberg's music and his musical language. So while there is definitely some sort of shared musical language between the composers, they are very much unique in and of themselves. And it's fascinating because Weinberg, when Andrei Zhdanov had his infamous Prikaz 17, the anti-formalist sort of campaign, Weinberg himself wasn't necessarily named on that list, but some of his pieces were sort of put on a warning list, if you will. Shostakovich was on that list, Prokofiev, Khachaturian, they were. So this work that you hear in 1950, it's actually a very folkloric piece that draws on actually a lot of klezmer roots as well, and you hear that especially in the finale of the work. And this is definitely, there is some political influence to this, because this is a time in Weinberg's life where, as a result of Andrei Zhdanov's decree, he began sort of drawing on less, formalistic compositional elements and drew again on these folkloric elements. And you hear that throughout this work. It's really a tremendous textured, beautiful piece. There's references definitely to Shostakovich's second piano trio that you hear in the finale in particular. But it's interesting because some of the movements and some of the musical sort of textures that are here are actually echoed by Shostakovich later in life in his sixth string quartet and in his 10th string quartet, which are the 10th one actually being dedicated to Mieczyslaw Weinberg. So it's very interesting to see sort of this interplay between those composers, but with a musical language that is really uniquely Weinberg's own.
I think if I could just add one thing to this, don't forget that the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, Stalin's part, is a very important factor. And so in this respect, Weinberg was disadvantaged both by the Nazis and to a degree in the Soviet Union. Fortunately, he was allowed to live out his life in the Soviet Union. And I would say the most extraordinary work that I have heard and seen is his opera, The Idiot, based on Dostoevsky, which I saw in St. Petersburg at the Mariinsky Theater. And when you think basically in the same neighborhood where Dostoevsky lived and about St. Petersburg society, to see that opera, it was 4 hours long. I'm not recommending it just yet to everybody, but to see that produced to an audience where you know that almost everybody in the audience had read The Idiot, in school, was a very, very powerful and moving experience at the time. Weinberg, there's a lot of Weinberg to be, and thank goodness for people like Adam who are getting it out there, because if you like Bartók, you're going to love Schulhoff, you're going to love Weinberg, I would say.
Definitely. And it's fascinating, again, much like Schreker fits in this interesting sort of musical lineage and is this aesthetic link between all these different schools of Western classical music. You see that with Weinberg as well, and with his references to Bartók, to Prokofiev, to Shostakovich, and his contemporaries. And he occupies this really just fascinating era. And it almost feels like with a lot of these recovered voices composers, there's almost this lost like treasure trove of music that it's old, yes, but it also feels like it's new. And as a performer, that's something that's incredibly gratifying, to be able to have almost like carte blanche to interpret this music like almost for the first time in a way, which is very exciting to do.
Somebody once said to me, an old book read for the first time is a new book. The fact is that because this music has been largely unplayed. For anybody who's going to take a chance and listen to it, it's going to be a new experience. Somebody asked me the other day, how many pieces are there? I said, oh, thousands. They said, well, no, how many good pieces? I said, hundreds. He said, hundreds of pieces are good and thousands? I said, yes, that's right. It's one of the greatest volumes of music that has been canceled or put to the side or shoved to the side for political and reasons of bigotry. And so if you want to know it, please listen. I'm sure you will love a lot of it. And, you know, if you want to, if you want to answer the question, well, how did it never get performed? Well, some of these people's music was performed, others was not. But, you know, Schubert wasn't performed. A lot of Schubert never saw the light of day until after he was dead. So the fact is that those are not the criterion. The criterion is we know that there was a massive genocide, a massive suppression, and unfortunately, with all wars, even those today, we know that culture is also a victim of those wars and those suppressions.
You know, if I could just stop it. It seems to me that Weinberg is one of those kind of a success story now in terms of there being the type of work that you're doing has rekindled a fairly large interest in his work in particular. That's been really wonderful to see, you know, given the volume of music that he has to offer. And I'm wondering if you, if both of you, if there are any other composers that you would like to just mention that you feel are, I mean, I'm a big fan of all of this undiscovered music. I think there's so much great music out there. So I don't mean to prioritize any, but if there's any examples that you want to give of composers that our audience should look into in addition to the ones that they're going to hear today.
Well, I mean, I'll start with Alexander Zemlinsky. Yes, Franz Schreker. Yes, Walter Braunfels. Yes, Victor Ullmann and the other composers who were in Terezin with him, Gideon Klein, Pavel Haas, Hans Kraja. Absolutely. Benjamin Fleischmann, young, died at 24 years old, a student of Shostakovich. These are only a few, but I'd say if you, again, have a chance to visit the Aurel Foundation website, we have 25 biographies there. You can start with any one of them that would interest you. What would you say?
Well, definitely. Well, I would like to emphasize again Erwin Schulhoff, big time. We have our whole Schulhoff and More series that we put out. Maestro Conlin gives 4 wonderful talks about the life and the times of Erwin Schulhoff, as well as a sort of Recovered Voices 101 lecture in which he unpacks the whole mission and goes into greater depth about some of these composers. But Schulhoff, especially, I'm always thinking as a string player too, Schulhoff's string quartet writing is just fabulous. And it's so amazing to be able to put together wonderful chamber music that you haven't heard before. He has great violin sonatas. His piano writing also, highly recommend. He was one of the first to really successfully implement jazz into a Western classical idiom, and that's fascinating. Not to mention the fact that he was the first to write silence into music 30 years before John Cage did it in his In Futurum movement of his 5 Pittoresken, which is a peak Dada work where Schulhoff literally writes out rests. It's all notated, but it's very meticulous, and you can actually interpret that in an interesting way. But the fact that we don't know about that in our Norton Anthology of Western music, whatever, it's criminal.
Never heard it. Never heard it.
Yeah, literally.
Never heard it. And by the way, while we're bragging about him, he actually started writing jazz before everybody else, before Milhaud, before Gershwin, before. Just, I mean, from the very beginning, he believed that jazz would be the music of the future, and he wrote not as a incidental piece of music of jazz. He believed in the integration of the two traditions. Fascinating man, and by the way, because he wrote so much chamber music, it is more easily, it's available to so many people. You know, there are symphonies, but there's a lot of chamber music and piano music that you can pick up tomorrow, play, listen to, enjoy.
I wanted to mention, to follow up on what you've all said, that this program from the Colburn School is part of a 3-part series that the library did. And this very much came about through our meeting you and Bob Elias. We are partnering with the ARC Ensemble, which is presenting works by 3 composers I had never known before. One is Franz Kreselitzer, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And another was Verdina Shlonsky, a name I had not heard. And these are fascinating pieces. We also have a special project presenting a program about von der Lange's two Pleyel harpsichords looted by the Nazis from her home outside Paris, and one of them found its way to the library. Eventually, another. We also will be performing, having someone perform some of her unknown compositions. So this is a tripartite project to which we're indebted to you, for which we're indebted to you. I wanted to ask a quick question, and then maybe David, you may have a couple of questions. I wondered if at the Colburn School you're thinking of doing any of the operas. You've done such an incredible job of the chamber music. Are you tempted at all about some of these operas?
Well, we have, actually I have, although it predates the Tsering Conlon initiative and it predates Adam, actually. We did do an opera by Hans Krennic here. It's called Königreich, the realm of the king. We did do Victor Ullmann's most famous work, The Kaiser from Atlantis, which fortunately has made the rounds of international world theaters and schools, partially because it is a small chamber opera. It was written in Terezin to be performed. We know it was not performed. We are not quite sure why it wasn't performed, but this is a unique work, and we've also done that here at the Colburn School. And of course, I'd be delighted if another opportunity presents itself, of course.
We thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today to really give this background on the extraordinary work that you've been doing. And on behalf of the library, we would like to say we'd love to continue to partner with you. You have we share many of the same goals, but because of you, you have helped to restore a few of these composers to what should be their rightful place in the history of 20th century music. So thank you to both of you and to the Colburn School. We're very grateful and look forward to sharing your video with all of our viewers very soon.
Thank you very much for both of us. Thank you so much.